There is a component sitting inside almost every diesel truck built after 2010 that a mechanic can be federally prosecuted for touching, even when it's the reason the truck won't move. Between 2020 and 2023 alone, federal regulators closed out 172 civil cases and 17 criminal cases against the people who fix these systems, not the people who pollute with them. 54 months of prison time handed out to mechanics. One of them was a 65-year-old diesel mechanic in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who spent decades keeping his town's school buses, snowplows, and ambulances running through brutal winters. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the exact system built to clean up American air turned the men who repair trucks into felons, and why, in the last 6 months, the federal government quietly reversed course. This isn't a story about a handful of outlaw shops. It touches an estimated 550,000 diesel trucks nationwide, with disabled or bypassed emission systems, and every mechanic who's ever been asked to fix one. The penalties are not symbolic. A single tampering event can carry a civil fine of $4,527. A single non-compliant vehicle can cost $45,268. Record-keeping violations run $45,268 per day. For a small repair shop, that's not a fine, that's a shutdown. That's exactly what happened to the mechanic in Wyoming. His diesel exhaust fluid systems kept freezing solid in sub-zero temperatures, triggering automatic power derates that left farm trucks, plows, and emergency vehicles crawling at reduced power, or dead, in the middle of winter. His solution was to remove the failing components and reprogram the engines to restore function. He pleaded guilty in 2024. He was sentenced to prison. His shop was fined $52,500 and closed permanently. Snow-covered rural road, disabled truck pulled to the shoulder. The system he ran into wasn't built by a villain twirling a mustache. It's an engineering stack, a diesel particulate filter, a selective catalytic reduction unit, and a diesel exhaust fluid injection system, layered on top of diesel engines starting in the late 2000s to cut pollution. The architecture works exactly as designed. What it wasn't designed for was what happens when that system fails in the field, in real weather, on a truck that has to run anyway. But this is only the surface layer. To understand how a repair became a felony, you have to go back to the mid-2000s, when regulators mandated a new generation of after-treatment hardware on every new diesel engine sold in America. The goal was measurable and real. Over the following decade, these systems cut soot from diesel engines by 90% and nitrogen oxide emissions by 97%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a transformation of American air quality. But stacking 3 failure-prone systems onto a work truck created a new kind of vulnerability. DEF freezes, filters clog, sensors fail, and federal law treated almost any repair that touched these systems, even a temporary bypass to keep a truck moving, the same way it treated a manufacturer cheating an emissions test. 3 words, no distinction made. Then came Dieselgate. When one major manufacturer was caught building software specifically to cheat emissions tests, the political appetite for tolerance evaporated. Regulators didn't just go after manufacturers, they built a national enforcement program aimed squarely at independent shops, tuners, and the aftermarket parts that let trucks run without a functioning DEF system. Diesel exhaust fluid bottles on a shop shelf, tuner handheld device on a workbench. The Wyoming case became one face of that program. Investigators alleged his shop had disabled onboard diagnostic systems on at least 344 heavy-duty commercial trucks. That's not one truck. That's a small fleet operator's entire pollution footprint, multiplied across an entire regional economy of farms and fire departments. New information, once a minute. Shops nationwide were raided. Tuner manufacturers faced federal charges. Asset seizures followed civil settlements. By the time the enforcement wave crested, EPA and DOJ had collected $55.5 million in civil penalties and $5.6 million in criminal fines, on top of the prison sentences. 2 words, real money. Individual cases show how granular the enforcement got. One exhaust company was fined $1.6 million for selling defeat devices. A performance shop in California paid over $3 million in combined criminal fines and civil penalties for manufacturing illegal tunes. A trucking company in Maine was ordered to pay $2 million after tampering with just 31 heavy-duty trucks, roughly $64,500 per truck, more than many of those trucks were worth on the used market. Auction lot of used heavy-duty trucks, price signage. The pattern repeats across a decade of case files. It was rarely the largest fleet operators who got caught. It was small, independent shops, the kind run by one or two mechanics, absorbing penalties sized for corporations. The enforcement machine didn't distinguish between a company gaming an emissions test for profit and a mechanic in Wyoming trying to keep an ambulance moving in a blizzard. Under the statute, both were tampering. Both faced the same maximum exposure, up to 5 years in prison and up to $250,000 per vehicle. But here's what most people get wrong. Most people assume this crackdown was primarily about air quality. The numbers tell a different story, a story about the economics of downtime. Fleet Dispatch Office, trucks idling in a yard. A 2023 survey of independent truckers found that 40% had experienced an emissions-related breakdown. Multiply that across a national fleet running on tight delivery windows, and you're not looking at a pollution problem anymore. You're looking at a logistics problem with a pollution label on it. Every D-rated truck sitting in a yard is a driver not being paid, a load not being delivered, and a business absorbing a cost nobody budgeted for. Here's the human scale version. A single EPA settlement against one aftermarket parts company hit $1.6 million. That's more than most independent repair shop owners will gross in a decade. A $52,500 shop fine on its own is more than the median American household earns in a full year. These aren't parking tickets. They're business-ending events, applied to the people doing the physical labor of keeping trucks moving, not the manufacturers who designed a system with no field repair pathway built in. Now here's the counterintuitive turn. For 15 years, the direction of federal policy moved in exactly one direction: tighter enforcement, harsher penalties, more prosecutions. Then, in January 2026, the Department of Justice announced it would stop pursuing criminal charges for emissions tampering entirely. Weeks later, the EPA issued guidance allowing repair shops and farmers to temporarily override emission systems, specifically to make repairs. By February, the agency was reconsidering whether the automatic power cutoff derate, the exact mechanism that disabled trucks in the Wyoming case, was even necessary as a compliance tool at all. EPA building exterior, generic government office. That's the reveal. This wasn't a pollution science reversal. Nitrogen oxide standards didn't get looser. What changed was that the economic cost of forced downtime, on farms, in fleets, on ambulances, finally outweighed the political cost of easing enforcement. The system that criminalized repair for a decade and a half didn't bend because the air got dirtier. It bent because the math on downtime finally got too expensive to ignore. Civil penalties, though, never went away. They're still active, still up to $45,268 per vehicle. The federal government removed the threat of prison. It did not remove the threat of financial ruin. If you've spent any time around a truck, you already suspected this wasn't really about clean air at the ground level. It was about who gets to define the difference between keeping a critical vehicle running and a federal crime. And for 15 years, that definition was written by people who never had to stand in a Wyoming parking lot at -20 degrees with a dead ambulance. Here's what most viewers watching this still don't realize. The DOJ's 2026 announcement did not make deletes legal. It stopped criminal prosecution. Civil fines, the ones that shut down shops, are still fully in force, and state-level enforcement in places like California hasn't moved an inch. Anyone who saw headlines saying diesel deletes are legal now and acted on it is operating with exactly half the picture. Understanding that distinction, criminal risk gone, civil and state risk very much alive, puts you ahead of most people currently making decisions about their trucks based on a headline instead of the underlying law. And the mechanic from Wyoming, Troy Lake, whose case became the symbol of this entire fight, he was pardoned by the federal government in November 2025, months before the DOJ policy shift that followed in his case's wake. His felony conviction, and the shop it cost him, came first. The policy reversal came after. Which brings us to what happens next. The regulatory pendulum that just swung toward relief for mechanics and fleet owners can swing back just as fast, under a different administration, with a different set of priorities. Nothing about the underlying Clean Air Act has changed, only the willingness to enforce it criminally, And that willingness is a policy choice, not a law. Empty diesel repair bay at dusk, lights being switched off. For the mechanics still working on these trucks today, the rules they operate under were decided in Washington, changed in 6 months, and could change again in the next 6. The next diesel truck rolling into a repair bay in sub-zero weather won't care what the political climate is in DC. It will just need to run, and someone will have to decide, in that moment, what repair is legally allowed to mean.